Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. Great, that's more like it. All right. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for making this program possible. Thank you to Ben and everybody involved in making this conference possible, and thank you to you all for sticking around. I know this is the end of the conference, and there's other things you could be doing with your Saturday, so I appreciate you being here. I owe you an apology. I wanted to be here all day yesterday for the conference. The program looked terrific. But as was alluded to, I have a 4-month-old baby at home, and I was sort of negotiating with my wife about how many days I could be away. And this was the compromise position. So I'm here for today and going back early tomorrow. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope that in future conferences, like Verna, I can come back and stay for longer. So Verna told you a little bit about me, but let me tell you a little bit about my background, because that helps explain how I came to this subject at all of the intersection between history, technology, and social media. So do not let these boyish good looks fool you. I have actually been in the field for quite some time. I've been around. I actually began my career in the museum field years and years ago, working at a place called the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. That's in New York City. My grandparents on my mother's side were Holocaust survivors. My mom was actually born in a displaced persons camp in Germany after the Second World War. They were not allowed to come to the United States because of quotas and anti-Semitism, so they went to Canada. And then from Canada, my mom went to school in the United States and met my dad. And then my mom and my dad made me. So that's sort of my story. And Holocaust history has always been very personally and professionally important to me. So I began my career working on museum exhibits about the Second World War. The first exhibit I did was about American Jews who served in the American military during the Second World War. There were 550,000 Jews who served in the American military during the war, including my grandfather on the other side of my family. He was a chief warrant officer in the Army. My wife is also in the Army, so we have military in our family for a couple of generations, and we expect that our son will also be joining the service. He doesn't know that yet, but from there, I helped to create an exhibition about Jewish refugees who came to New York City after the Second World War. So that included Jews from Europe, but it also included Jews from the Middle East and from Iran and from Cuba, even the former Soviet Union. And eventually, I left the museum and went to work in archives and libraries. So the archivists in the room, I am your people. I actually have an advanced certificate in archival management from NYU. One of the jobs I had as an archivist was actually to work at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Not in Cleveland, they have an office in New York City. That's where they collect most of the material. So a quick story about that. I was in the archive one day cataloging material. I get a call from my boss. He says, come downstairs in 20 minutes. I come downstairs. He pulls up in the car. What's in the back seat? Jimmy Page's amplifier. Jimmy Page being the guitarist from Led Zeppelin, for those of you who don't know. So that was sort of the stuff we got to do at the Rock Hall. At one point, I lived in the Dominican Republic, helping to create a Jewish museum there. Some people may know that on the eve of World War II, there were Jewish refugees that were rescued from Central Europe and settled in the Dominican Republic. The idea was to create, for them to be farmers. So they took over an abandoned banana plantation, and they made their own cheese and made their own milk. By their own admission, it was terrible cheese and terrible milk, but they survived the war there, and after the war, they went to the US and Israel and South America, but there's a small museum there that tells that story, and I was the first person to look at those records in over 50 years when I went down there. And eventually, I found my way to the Library of Congress. And I worked at the Library of Congress for 7 years. The first 2.5 years was collecting the stories of America's war veterans for the library, something called the Veterans History Project, which if you're not familiar with, I encourage you, I can send you more information. And then for 4.5 years, I worked at something called the John W. Kluge Center, bringing scholars from around the world to the library to do research in our collections and sharing those research with members of Congress and policymaking community. From there, I became the founding director of something called the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, then a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and I got involved with the State Department. I do a number of trips with them, and eventually I wrote this book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Well, throughout my career, I've been very interested in how public audiences interact with history and learn about the past, or at least think they learn about the past. And sometimes that happens in a museum gallery, sometimes it happens in an archive, sometimes it happens inside the walls of the Library of Congress. But increasingly, it became clear to me that public audiences were learning, or at least trying to learn, history from their phones. And so I asked myself a very simple question. What does that mean? What does it mean to try to learn history from your phone? What does it mean when all this historical information is mediated through these devices and these tiny screens? Is it even possible to learn history from your phone? And what does that do to our understandings of history? So those were the questions that began to preoccupy me, and eventually I decided there was a book here worth writing, and I must tell you, the answers to those questions have proven to be far more complicated and complex than I ever imagined. So, this is where I used to work, inside the Library of Congress. How many people have been to the Library of Congress? Oh, good. You know, sometimes I go and nobody raises their hand, so it's always a big tragedy for me. But I got to work inside this building. My office was right down the corridor from where this picture was taken. And one of the people the Library of Congress is a great place to think big thoughts about the world, right? And one of the people I met at the Library of Congress when I was there was this guy, David Grinspoon. And David is an astrobiologist. Who knows what astrobiology is? Astrobiology is the scientific study for the conditions of life beyond Earth. So basically, we have enough information now about the moons around Jupiter and Saturn and the clouds around Venus to surmise that whether there could be life there. Now, we're not talking about ET-style life. We're talking about microbes, right? Little tiny things. But David is a Venus guy. He works on Venus. He's actually advising NASA on their mission to Venus in 2028. And he is also what he calls a science communicator working in the field of science communication. So David and his colleagues think very critically and analytically about how scientific information needs to be conveyed through various media forms in order to best affect public policy and public understandings of science. And so the more I got to talking with David about science communication, the more I asked myself, why doesn't history have this? Why don't we have something called history communicators, and why aren't we training people to be specialists in something called history communication? So around 2015, 2016 time period, I actually suggested this to colleagues in our field. I said we should create something called history communication, we should train people to be history communicators, and we should think critically and analytically about how historical information gets conveyed through various media, especially when we're all carrying media in our pockets all the time. If you know anything about the history profession, you will not be surprised that some people thought this was a great idea and some people thought it was a terrible idea, and it sparked lots of debate and conversation. But the more that we were talking about this, the more that history content started to just pop up online everywhere. Now, this is a video that came out in 2015. Is anybody here familiar with this video? Sometimes when I speak to audiences, there are people who are familiar with it. Yeah, okay. So this video, which we may talk about a little bit later if there's time, received somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 million views online. Now, to put that in perspective, I told you I wrote a book. Did you know that 95% of all books never sell more than 1,000 copies? My book has sold more than 1,000 copies. That puts it in the top 5% of all books. Academic journal articles, right? In this audience, you will not be surprised to hear that 82% of academic journal articles are never cited once. So if I was to write a journal article about the American Civil War or write a book about the American Civil War, chances are very few people would read it. But a video about the American Civil War can reach 30 to 40 million people online, right? So something was clearly going on here. But it wasn't just videos like this that were popping up on the internet. It was content all over the internet popping up about history, right? Whether it be on Telegram, whether it be on Instagram, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be on Facebook. We've all seen content like this. You know, sometimes when I give these talks, I see these light bulbs going off in people's minds, especially students, because they know that they've seen stuff like this, but they don't realize it until I point it out. And so then they start, oh yeah, that's right, I have seen stuff like this on Facebook, right? There's all this history content everywhere, right? And again, this is 2015, 2016, 17 time period. There's a lot of conversation at that time about social media and its effect on politics, social media, its effects on journalism. No one was writing about social media's effects on history. Fast forward to 2018, this is a graphic that's a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to pull out a couple statistics for you. We all know that there's a lot of information on the internet, but sometimes I feel like it's helpful to see it visually represented. In 2018, YouTube users watched 4.3 million videos every single minute of every single day. 4.3 million videos every minute of every day. When I talk to students, I tell them to take out a calculator. 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks in a year. It's a lot of content that is being ingested on these platforms. Twitter users sending 473,000 tweets every single minute of every single day. My question was, how much of this is history content? How much of this is content that purports to be teaching you something about the past? Now, it turns out that that's a very hard question to answer because it's a huge universe of content, but there are some researchers in Germany that we are working with who have come up with an approximation of an answer. On TikTok, which is not on this graphic, but will be on the graphic I'll show you in a few minutes, on TikTok, videos with the hashtag history, last year, 58 billion, with a B. 58 billion videos on TikTok with the hashtag history. And that was last year, so it's well over 100 billion now. On Instagram, with the hashtag history, 50 million posts. Again, that's last year's number, so it's well over 100 million. And that's just with the hashtag history. That doesn't even account for other hashtags that are history related. So this is a huge universe of content online, and no one was writing about it. So I figured I would be the person to write about it. So in 2019, I wrote the first draft of the book, 2020, the second draft of the book, third draft, 2021. The book came out at the beginning of 2022. I've been on the road talking about the book for over 2 years. This is my 221st event about the book. The book has been a bestseller, as I mentioned. It's been in all kinds of different media. The reason I put up this slide is not to pat myself on the back, but because to tell you a funny story. When I was pitching this book in 2018, 2019 to publishers and literary agents, they all told me that no one would read it. They said it was too niche of a subject, nobody cares, and why don't you write a book about Trump instead? That people will read. Well, Trump does make an appearance in the book in a couple of different places, but I'm very glad I didn't write a whole book about Trump. I think the book that I wrote wound up being much more interesting, but I think the fact that people have read this book shows us two things. Number one, well, three things. First thing, literary agents are often wrong. Second thing, we care a lot about social media and what it's doing to our lives, and this book fills in an important gap about social media and what it's doing to us. But most critically, for us here in the room, people actually really care about history. Right? If you look at all the debates that are happening, not just in the United States, but around the world. I mean, I traveled with the State Department to Belgium, Germany, Georgia, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Hungary. In every single place I've been, history is informing political and societal debates. And increasingly, those debates are happening online. So understanding how history operates online actually gives us insight not just into history, but actually into some of the biggest political and societal questions of our time. So this book, I think, actually fills an important role, and it's one of the reasons why I think that diplomats and journalists and science communicators and other people are reading this book beyond just the history profession, because it actually gives us insight into a much bigger story about what's happening in the online universe. Now, since the time I wrote the book, social media has not gone away. That was the other thing the publisher told me. They said, you better get this book out quick, because what happens if people stop using social media? Well, I can tell you that people have not stopped using social media. So this graphic shows you updated numbers. TikTok is now on here. TikTok users watch 167 million videos every minute of every day. Let me say that again. TikTok users watch 167 million videos every minute of every day. There are 175 million items in the Library of Congress. So basically, TikTok users are watching the entire Library of Congress every single minute of every single day, right? It's a staggering amount of data that is being consumed. I have lots of problems with TikTok, which I can talk about later if you're interested, but social media has not gone away. And what's really interesting about this, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, it turns out that the way people communicate history on social media actually stays remarkably consistent. In other words, the way that people communicate about history on Facebook in the 2010s is actually incredibly similar to how they do it on TikTok in the 2020s. It's just been tweaked slightly for the format. It's almost as if social media teaches you how to behave. And once you learn those behaviors, you take them with you from platform to platform. And that has huge implications for not only how we communicate history, but what types of historical stories even make it into our news feeds. I'll talk about why in a minute. While I was working on the book, the Frameworks Institute in Washington, D.C. actually came out with a report which confirmed everything which I suspected, which was that pop culture, social media, and the news media were playing an increasingly larger role in influencing public thinking about the past. And of course they are, because we have these devices in our hands, in our pockets all day, and we're on them 10 to 12 hours per day. Okay, so now let's talk about what's in the book. If you remember from a few minutes ago, my history communicators, history communication, I like to make up new words. So for this book, I've made up another new word, and that word is e-history. So moving forward, I'm going to use the term e-history to describe all this content on social media and the web that purports to teach you something about the past. All 58 billion TikTok videos, all 40 million Instagram posts, they are all examples of what I call e-history, and I'm going to justify that definition by using the parallel example of e-commerce, okay? So, if I walk into a store and I give the person behind the counter money and they give me back a product or a service, that's commerce. If I go to Amazon, I buy something online, they send it to my house, that's e-commerce. So what's the difference? It's not a trick question, it's a very simple answer. What's the difference? Come on, what's the difference? Come on. Yeah. This is not a hard question, right? I'm going to argue that the difference is actually twofold. Number one is very simply the location that transaction happens. One happens in the physical world, one happens in the virtual world. And it's important I use the word transaction, right? So it is a transaction. And I'm going to argue that e-history is a transaction as well. So that's one. But the second is actually the more important part. And I'm going to argue, and I argue in the book, that there are actually certain mechanisms in place that make e-commerce possible. In other words, Amazon has to have a way to take my credit card information and send it securely to a server. That server has to be able to talk to a warehouse. The warehouse has to be able to talk to a driver. And driver uses GPS to get to my door, right? So having those mechanisms, that infrastructure behind the scenes is what makes e-commerce possible. And I'm going to argue that the same is true of e-history. There are actually certain mechanisms behind the scenes that make e-history possible. If you understand those mechanisms, then you understand why certain history shows up in your newsfeed and why others do not. Because of the 167 million videos on TikTok that you could see every single minute, how many do you actually see? 1, 2, maybe 3, right? So what dictates why you see a certain video versus another? What dictates why you see one historical story as opposed to a different historical story? And the answer is because there are certain mechanisms behind the scenes that privilege certain types of historical content and make it so that other types of historical content you will never see. And so if you understand those mechanisms, then you understand why certain types of e-history online are becoming influential and visible and why others are not. So, this is the definition of e-history. It's on the very first page of the book. E-history are discrete media products that package an element or elements of the past for consumption on the social web and which try to leverage the social web in order to achieve visibility. Examples include history YouTube videos, Twitter threads, Instagram posts, etc. This is a very dense definition, so we'll break it out really quickly. The past is a very big place. You can't tell all of it in the small space of your screen or in a small tweet. So what you have to do is you have to take an element of the past, whether it be the American Civil War or the story of Little House on the Prairie or whatever it is, and you have to package it into a media product that can be delivered on these devices. So that's the first part of the definition. But the second part of the definition is the most critical because I argue that all e-history is fighting to get seen in your newsfeed. Because if it gets seen by you, then it can influence how you think about the world. So all e-history is fighting to achieve visibility. It's fighting to show up on your screen, on your Facebook feed, on your Twitter feed, on your Instagram feed, etc. And the way that it does that is by leveraging how social media was built and operated. And the better it leverages how social media operates, the more likely you are to see it. And the worse it leverages social media, the less likely you are to see it. right? So all e-history is trying to leverage the social web in order to achieve visibility. So we go back to this video. This is an example of a very successful piece of e-history. It successfully leveraged how social media has been built and designed in order to achieve 30 to 40 million views on web. If I put up a video about the American Civil War today, how many people think it would get 30 to 40 million views? Right? Probably wouldn't. But this video did, because it leveraged certain ways that social media has been built and designed in order to achieve that visibility. So, what are some of the ways that this video achieved such high visibility on social media?
Slavery. Confederate flag.
Yeah, exactly. The Confederate flag. Why is that important? Well, I told you that this video came out, I may have told you, in the summer of 2015. Right? And we remember what happened in the summer of 2015, the shooting in Charleston, right? And then the prompt re-examination of the Confederate flag everywhere, all over the news, all over the webs, politicians talking about it, etc., right? So it makes sense to strategically release a video at that time that puts the Confederate flag front and center, right? It leverages how social media privileges the news cycle and how it privileges very evocative imagery in order to get this video in front of your face. Because if you were to make a video about the American Civil War, you could choose any number of different images to use, right? Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, different regiments, different war locations. I mean, there's different battlefields. There's any number of different images you can choose. But the timing of this video and the imagery that it chooses are critical to its success in achieving high visibility. So when I talk to students in particular, these are the types of questions that I want to get them asking. I want them to understand why certain pieces of content are created at certain times, who creates them, what are the agendas behind it, and most critically, what mechanisms of social media is it leveraging in order to achieve visibility. Because if students understand that, then they become more media literate and historically literate information consumers. They can ask better questions about the content that they are seeing. So all of that content that I showed you before, all these examples of e-history, all of these have stories behind them about who created them, why they were created, and most critically, what mechanisms of social media they are leveraging in order to show up in your news feed and influence how you think. So when it turns out we asked the question, how much of this social media universe is comprised of e-history, it turns out that e-history is actually everywhere. There are millions, actually billions, of e-history videos, blogs, memes, social media accounts competing for our attention, advancing political and commercial agendas, and actively reshaping what we know about the past. Some amass millions of views, others are barely seen, some are accurate, some are not, some are created by professional historians, others are made by journalists, history enthusiasts, white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and even foreign disinformation agents. It can often be difficult to determine which e-history is created by whom. That last sentence is really important. When I did the interviews for my book, I heard from people over and over and over again that, they're on YouTube. The first video they see is maybe by a professional historian. Then the next one is by a journalist. Then the one after that is by Russia Today. It's not all this stuff is labeled in people's news feeds, right? So it puts a lot of burden on the information consumer to determine which historical information online is accurate and reliable. And I will point out to you, if it's not already clear already, that accuracy plays no role in this equation. Right? You could put up the most accurate video about the American Civil War and no one would see it, and you could put up the most inaccurate version of the American Civil War and it could get millions and millions of views. Why? Because what matters is how well the e-history leverages how social media was built and designed. Social media was built and designed with certain assumptions for types of content that it privileges. Accuracy is not one of those considerations. So when you're thinking about creating historical content in your context, whether it be a museum, a historical society, a library, remember that the accuracy of the information, while critical to us as historians, is not actually what the social web privileges. You have to leverage how social media was built and the mechanics of these platforms in order to get your content visible and influential in people's feeds. Making accurate historical information is unfortunately not enough to succeed in an online e-history environment. So, real quick, I keep talking about these different mechanisms, so let me tell you what they are. Because this is what really surprised me. I mentioned that it stays very consistent, right? Facebook in the 2010s, TikTok in the 2020s, relying on the same mechanisms, right? I did not expect to find this. Going into this project with billions and billions of pieces of e-history content online, I did not expect to come out at the end thinking that there are really 7 ways that e-history becomes visible online, but that is sort of the conclusion that I've come to after doing the research, and this has still held up 2 years later. Again, because this is how the platforms have been designed and built. And so the content on these platforms that leverages the way these platforms have been built is the ones that tend to be successful over and over and over again. And so here I have them mapped out. These are the various chapters in the book, by the way. So if you want more on each of these, you can go into the book and find them. But let me just break down the first 2, because we don't have time to go through all of them. And then I want to briefly touch on artificial intelligence, because Ben asked if I would do that quickly to wrap up. The first one, the crowdsourced past. Examples including Wikipedia, Reddit, and Quora. Okay. So the web and social media are built on signals of attention. The more signals of attention that people are giving something, the higher up in the feed it will appear. Anybody here use Reddit? A couple people, okay. So this is how Reddit works, right? You put up a post on Reddit, let's say you put up a post on Reddit about history, and no one comments on it, there's no signals given back to the algorithm that people are paying attention to it, it stays at the bottom of the feed, no one sees it. But the more that people comment on it, or like it, or star it, or upvote, the higher in the feed it gets. So that if you go to the homepage of Reddit, you see at the top of the feed, the content that gets the most visibility is the content that has received the most signals of attention from other users. So, this is a great way to get your e-history seen, is to lean into the crowdsourcing mechanisms of these platforms and the way they privilege signals of attention. You can get tens of thousands of people to comment on something, it will get more visibility than if only 10 people comment on something, regardless of how accurate it is. Now, the flip side of this is that this is oftentimes how disinformation campaigns work. Because you think about, for example, Russian bots, which we've heard a lot about in the news over the past few years. What they do is they literally have thousands and thousands of people who are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to do just this, right? Take a piece of information about, let's say, Ukraine, for example, that is historically inaccurate or somehow distorted or warped in some way, and just get lots of people from allegedly different accounts to comment on it, and the web and social media read that as signals of attention, a crowd giving something some attention, and it rises to the top of the feed, then it spills over to other platforms. In my book, I actually use an example from Japan. There's a far-right movement in Japan that has a very different interpretation of Japanese history, and they use platforms like 4chan and 8chan to crowdsource their visions and versions of history to the top of the feed, and then from there it spills over into Wikipedia and other places. So the crowdsourced past is a very reliable way to get your e-history visible online, regardless of whether it's accurate or not. Let's look at the second one, nostalgia on demand. How many of you use Facebook? How many of you use it for work purposes, to share historical content? Okay. Did you know that Facebook newsfeed was actually purposely built to privilege nostalgia? There's a whole chapter on it in my book that explains how and why that happened. Well, if you are saying to yourself, you know what, I tend to see a lot of nostalgia content on Facebook, a lot of anniversary posts, a lot of on this day posts, a lot of remember when posts, that's not an accident. Okay? The newsfeed was actually purposely designed to privilege that type of information. So, if you are using Facebook to communicate history professionally, that is information that you need to be considering, right? Your nostalgic content, your old photographs, those are going to work really well on Facebook because Facebook was actually designed to privilege that type of content, to keep people on the newsfeed longer and engaging with the content more. On the flip side, though, that nostalgia can become very dangerous. I've spent a considerable amount of time in the State Department, with the State Department in the Balkans recently, And in the Balkans right now, they are experiencing a resurgence of what they call Yugo nostalgia, the idea that life was better under the Tito dictatorship. And a lot of that is being fed through Facebook. Old photographs of the communist era, posts that talk about how good it was back then because everybody could get a job, you can go to Italy and get expensive jeans, and everybody could afford to drive a car. And a lot of that is actually being sown and seeded by anti-democratic forces, anti-EU forces, anti-US forces, right? So understanding that you have this platform that reaches billions of people, that privileges nostalgia, and you couple that with dictators and autocrats who traffic in nostalgia, and suddenly when you go to these regions and you see where all these nostalgic emotions of dictatorship are starting to come to the fore, in places where people use Facebook all the time, it makes sense. It's a potent combination, a platform that privileges nostalgia with dictators who traffic in nostalgia. So at the same time, we have to think about how these platforms can be used by us to communicate history effectively. We also have to recognize their downsides and their pitfalls. And this is part of the media literacy and historical literacy that we're trying to do with the State Department and other places. So there's all kinds of examples in the book. I don't have time to talk about them now, but if you're interested, please do pick up a copy of the book or read it at your local library. I think it'll be very instructive for you as you think about how to communicate history effectively. The last thing I want to talk about, because I promised Ben that I would, and then I promise I'll open up for questions, is artificial intelligence. So actually, the second to last chapter in the book is called History.ai. And it's about how artificial intelligence might shape and change the way we communicate history about in the future, and also how people will learn about history or think they're learning about history as we integrate AI more into our lives. I'm sure many of you have been following the news stories with ChatGPT and its rollout. I gave a lecture at the Bulgarian Naval Academy in Varna, Bulgaria. Over 200 naval cadets from the Bulgarian Navy in the room. And I asked them how many of them were using ChatGPT, and they all raised their hands. I went to a high school in Latvia, a Russian-speaking high school outside of Riga, and I asked the same question. All the students raised their hands. It's amazing how fast this technology has been rolled out. It's the fastest platform to ever reach 100 million users, but I'm sure you're also aware that ChatGPT, quote unquote, hallucinates all the time, right? It generates completely incorrect prompts and responses on a regular basis. In fact, I once asked a large language model who won the Rose Bowl in 1959, and it gave me 3 different responses, all of which were wrong. So we have a massive challenge ahead of us where people are using these large language models to find answers to historical questions without any sources, right, being generated by the machine to tell us where it got the information from, and it frequently telling people inaccurate historical information. Now, part of the problem about these machines is that we're actually using them for things that they weren't designed to do. ChatGPT is not Google. It is not a search engine. It is a predictor of language. What ChatGPT is doing is it has been trained on billions of pieces of information across the web, and it tries to predict what order words should be in order to formulate a sentence that sounds like a human, right? So it knows that if I put the word Elon, chances are, high probability, the next word is going to be Musk. And the next word after that is going to be CEO. And the next word after that is going to be Twitter. So it generates a sentence that says Elon Musk is the CEO of Twitter. But it's not actually searching the web for that information. It's predicting what words should go in what order, which is a very different thing. However, we have not trained or told people that that is what's going on. We have rolled out, not we, OpenAI and others, have rolled out these technologies without any training, without any guardrails, and without any explanation of what these devices and machines are actually doing. And so as a result, you have students all around the world who are using these as search engines, as knowledge tools, when they are actually prediction tools. And a knowledge tool and a prediction tool, 2 very different things. So we have, as historians and people who believe in knowledge and accurate knowledge, have a huge challenge now in front of us. In addition to all the social media challenges we have, we also now have a huge challenge when it comes to getting people to understand the information that they get from large language models and artificial intelligence. Where does it come from? How has it been generated? What are the sources? And what is the difference between a predictive tool and a knowledge tool? And that is part of what we are trying to work on with my institute that was mentioned earlier, the History Communication Institute. Not only trying to do information literacy with information consumers around the world, but also working with tech platforms and tech companies to really think critically about what they're doing and what they're rolling out. So, as I conclude here, and there's a lot more I could say, I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about where this is all going. So, in the heels of the book, I actually created something with some colleagues called the History Communication Institute. And the idea of the HCI is to do all the things that I've already outlined in this talk. Number one, we want to be working with historians and history communicators to understand what types of history communication will work most effectively in an online environment, how to create e-history that is actually going to achieve visibility and influence in newsfeed. How do you compete with the millions of other pieces of content out there? You have to know how the platforms work, and you have to create your content in a way that the platforms will privilege. So that's part of the puzzle. Part of the puzzle is doing the literacy piece. So that's where the State Department comes in, other partners, trying to teach people about information literacy, historical literacy, how do we evaluate the information you see in your news feed every single day when it comes to history, what questions you need to be asking about it, and what mechanisms of the web is it leveraging in order to achieve visibility in your phone. And then the last piece is the partnership piece with technology companies, with different platforms. I actually presented a version of this talk to Microsoft recently. I've been working with a company called Project Liberty that's trying to create a new social networking experience. We're trying to build humanities and history into the platforms from the beginning so that they privilege accurate historical information in ways that the current platforms do not. So we have people all over the world who are working on this, as I mentioned, and if you want more information, these are the places to find it. I have a website. The History Communication Institute is at historycommunication.com, and I have a newsletter, which I know Ben is on and some other people are on, where we talk about these issues on a regular basis. We talk about examples of e-history. We talk about the different partnerships that we're doing, and I would love it if you all would subscribe to the newsletter, because that's a great way to stay in touch and for me to get feedback about what's happening in the world around us. So with that, if you want to support this project, these are the ways to do it. I thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to use this.
I'm going to run it back.
Okay.
Or, yeah, try to.
Okay.
Someone asked if I have a question. I have several. Here, where is the stratigraphic line? I'm going to talk about geology. They had the theory that the dinosaurs went extinct because of a meteor hitting the earth and all that sort of thing. And they kept looking for, and they found the line, the stratigraphic line. Below are dinosaurs, above are mammals. Information. Where is our stratigraphic line going to be? Is it 2023, 2024? Because where we can believe just about everything that we see printed, and everything above that line we take with a great amount of skepticism.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess on some level, that is a question for future historians to answer, right? Because the dinosaurs didn't know at the time where the line was. It was discovered later. And I think future historians will also have to determine where that line is for us, where we cross some sort of a threshold, because I think we're too much in the midst of it to know. You know, there's this joke about Heisenberg getting pulled over for speeding, and the cop asks him, "Do you know how fast you were going?" And he says, "No, but I can tell you where I am." Right? Because the Heisenberg principle, you can't know how fast you're going and where you are at the same time. So Yeah, I'm not sure that we have, I think we have to approach that question with a lot of humility. And I'm not sure we have the ability to answer that. I think that's for future historians to answer. Now, I will say, that assumes that there will be future historians. And that's not something that is guaranteed. In fact, the last chapter of my book is unfortunately a bit pessimistic, because I think one of the things that we're seeing as a result of all this, and this came very clear when I interviewed people for the book, time after time I heard from people, you know, why should I pay to take a history class when there's all this free history content on YouTube? Why should I ever pay a historian to come speak when I can listen to all these history podcasts for free, or go to the Khan Academy or PragerU to get historical information? And policymakers are asking the same questions. Why should we continue to support history departments when the enrollments are declining and there's no students in the classroom and all this free history content is available on the web? So part of the reason this book is called History Disrupted is because I actually think that the technologies that we've unleashed over the past 20 years have disrupted the entire history profession, to the point that I'm not convinced there will be a history profession in the future unless we fight and advocate for it. So part of the work that we're doing throughout all of this with the HCI and the book and everything else is trying to remind people how important it is that we have professional historians. Because the e-history that we have online, while it's exciting and it's scintillating and it racks up millions of views, it is no replacement for accurate professional history. Students don't know that, though, until you explain to them that the history they see in their news feeds has nothing to do with accuracy and everything to do with the way social media was built and designed. So we need to continue to make that argument for history to exist and professional history to be funded, and then hopefully those scholars can answer your very provocative question.
I don't share your pessimism, but I'm not even a historian.
Well, nobody's perfect.
As you said, the lacking accuracy of resources on the internet is yet another argument in favor of keeping, maintaining, and supporting scholarly journals, such as ours, South Dakota History, because anybody can upload anything to the internet, but I know, it's still pretty tough to get published in serious journals. So that's another argument.
Yeah, actually, I can
Yeah,
comment.
not a question, just that.
I can comment on that real quick, because I think, so one of the very interesting things is to go back and look at the history of Wikipedia. And that's actually what I do in one of the early chapters of my book. The founders of Wikipedia were very intentional to make Wikipedia the opposite of a scholarly journal, right? They wanted people to be able to post and edit right away. They wanted to remove the idea of peer review and scholarly review because they thought it was A, no fun, and B, too expensive, right? Some people may know this. The original idea for Wikipedia was actually something called Newpedia, and it was going to have a peer review system built into it. But the problem was the peer review system became too expensive. They weren't making enough money fast enough. They weren't able to sell enough advertising. So they said, well, if we let people just post and comment instantaneously for free, then we can get more eyeballs and we can charge more for ads. And so that's when they flipped it, and it took off. But to the point that was just made by Isvan, I argue in the book that Wikipedia actually set the stage for what came next. When we think about Y2K, right, and the 25 years since, Wikipedia in 2001 really sets the stage for the whole social web moving forward, I argue in the book. And part of that is the idea that you can post without any friction and without any effort. And that's one of the fundamental promises of the social web, that you can post instantly and see your results instantly. Now, there are a lot of benefits to that process. There's a lot of democracy, lowercase d, built into that process. But what you sacrifice as part of that process is the idea of peer review for accuracy and rigor and sophistication. So we need to have a world where both can exist. And unfortunately, over the years, we have seen that the support, funding and otherwise, for that second part of the equation is continuing to diminish as everybody rushes to create more free, unedited, unfiltered content online. So we need to make the argument for these things to continue to exist in our society and the value that they bring.
All right, we have one more question, then we're going to move on to the awards section.
This isn't a question. You just kept saying Wikipedia, and they do have review. Like if you posted, didn't you mean Facebook that didn't have review? Because Wikipedia will check your stuff and send you something.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is Wikipedia has editors, and those editors are volunteers, right? So they're not paid staff. And oftentimes those editors have familiarity with the subject, but they may not be subject matter experts. So the whole promise of Wikipedia was that regardless of your expertise level, you could contribute either by posting or by editing. And the editors, yeah, the source thing, we could have a whole discussion on Wikipedia. One thing I used to do when I was younger is I actually got paid to make Wikipedia pages for people. So I know all about the tricks that people play with sources, quote unquote, to make their Wikipedia pages pass the editor test, quote unquote. Wikipedia is not a neutral source. There are a lot of agendas at work at Wikipedia. A lot of people are paying to have their Wikipedia pages edited and sourced to make them look better, to remove information that they don't want out there in the public. There is a lot going on with Wikipedia. There's lots of papers that I've cited in the book about Wikipedia. This is another part of our information literacy challenge, because when I talk to high schools, for example, I hear from people, they say, oh, well, I saw this video on Instagram, and so in order to check its accuracy, I went to Wikipedia. And it's literally like I'm being stabbed in the chest. So there's a lot of literacy that we need to do when it comes to how to evaluate online sources. And Wikipedia is one of those places that right now young people just assume because it has sources and because it has editors that it's trustworthy. There's a lot more going on below the surface with Wikipedia, and teaching people how to evaluate entries on Wikipedia and seeing them as examples of e-history, I think is really critical, because there's a lot more checking that needs to happen than just going to a Wikipedia page. But we can talk more about that afterwards if you like.
We're actually going to do one more.
All right, one more.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering about if you have any thoughts on the effect of deepfakes on history. You know, it's interesting to me, if you go back 200 years, say, the only way to know that something had happened was to see it yourself. Other than that, you're relying on the secondhand account. Then we had photography, audio recording, video recording. It seems like in a way we're going back to how it was 200 years ago, where the only way you know something happened was to see it yourself, because like Kate Middleton puts out this video that says she has cancer, and everybody's questioning if it's really her or is it a deep fake. And I'm just interested what effect that's going to have on the historical record going forward if we can't trust these sources are authentic anymore.
Well, as the historians in the room know, there are lots of examples of fakes and forgeries in archives all over the world. And fakes and forgeries have actually been used to write inaccurate histories before. So in some ways, it's an extension or a continuation of a problem that has long existed in human society, is that we oftentimes make fakes and forgeries of things if we want to shape public opinion or present a certain view about the world. I will say that if you go onto Reddit right now, for example, there are some really fun subreddits where people have invented entire historical incidents that never happened. So you could see, for example, a nuclear meltdown that apparently happened during the Obama administration, with a press conference where Obama himself is speaking. It's completely deep-faked. Newspaper headlines that are completely deep-faked. photographs that are completely created by Midjourney. So you can actually recreate not only the event, but all of the documentation around the event and put it into your little subreddit and claim that XYZ thing happened. So that obviously, as historians who care about accuracy, that obviously makes us incredibly uncomfortable. But I will say that part of me feels like the question still remains whether any of this content becomes visible or not. And it still relies on the same mechanisms to achieve visibility, right? If I create a deep fake or AI-generated content about an event that never happened and no one sees it, then does it really have that much influence? But if I create something that is a deep fake and I'm able to get it viewed around the world and shape the way policymakers think, then that's a different kettle of fish. So I think for me, it still comes back to visibility, and it still comes back to understanding these mechanisms. Because ultimately, the artificial intelligence generated material is still going to leverage those mechanisms in order to achieve visibility. And so if you teach people what mechanisms are privileged by the social web, then they'll be able to ask questions about all content, whether it's AI generated or not. And we're actually seeing this right now because there's a lot of like nostalgia on demand content that is now being created by artificial intelligence as opposed to by human beings. So by understanding how the Facebook news feed privileges that types of nostalgia, we can arm people to ask better questions about that material. So I think all of this AI-generated material creates challenges for us, but from my vantage point, I still come back to the literacy component. And if we teach people more information, media, and historical literacy, and we understand better how these platforms operate and what types of content they privilege, then that gives us a better chance. Thank you all for your attention.